It always begins the same way, quietly, almost invisibly. You meet her, and something inside you shifts before a single real truth has even been spoken. She laughs, or she looks at you in a certain way, or she reflects back a version of yourself you didn't even know you were waiting to see. And in that moment, something dangerous happens. You don't meet her. You meet a feeling, a projection, a carefully constructed illusion your mind builds out of desire, loneliness, imagination, and hope. But you don't notice that, because illusion never announces itself as illusion. It arrives dressed as meaning. And so you begin to believe something without ever questioning it, that this is real, that this connection is special, that this person is different, that maybe, finally, something in your life is about to be completed through someone else. Nietzsche would call this the oldest mistake of human consciousness, the mistake of turning desire into truth. What you call love is often not love at all. It is interpretation. A story your mind writes and then forgets it wrote. You don't see her as she is. You see her as she appears inside the emotional framework you already needed. She becomes a symbol before she becomes a person. A symbol of peace, of validation, of escape, of completion. And the more incomplete you feel internally, the more powerful the symbol becomes. This is why love feels overwhelming in the beginning. Not because you have discovered truth, but because you have encountered your own imagination reflected back at you through another human being. Nietzsche warned about this form of blindness. He understood that human beings do not see reality first. They see their need first, and reality later. And so the relationship begins not with truth, but with projection. You begin assigning meaning to her gestures. A delayed reply becomes emotional distance. A small compliment becomes deep connection. A moment of silence becomes mystery. A moment of attention becomes destiny. You are no longer interacting with a person. You are decoding a fantasy. And the deeper you fall into interpretation, the further you drift from reality. But the mind prefers fantasy over emptiness. Because fantasy feels like direction. Emptiness feels like confrontation. And most people will do anything to avoid confronting themselves. This is where Nietzsche's insight cuts deeper than comfort allows. He suggested that most of what we call love is not an encounter with another being, but an escape from oneself. You do not only love her, you use her. Not in a malicious sense, but in an existential sense. You use her presence to stabilize your identity, to give shape to your emotional chaos, to quiet the questions you are afraid to answer alone. And because she temporarily reduces your internal uncertainty, you call that feeling love. But what you are actually experiencing is relief, and relief is not love. It is absence of pressure. Over time, something subtle begins to change. The fantasy that once felt natural starts requiring maintenance. You begin to interpret more, analyze more, hold on to small signals more tightly, because reality is slowly leaking through the cracks. She does not behave exactly as your imagination predicted. She has moods you didn't script, reactions you didn't account for, a life inside her that does not revolve around your emotional expectations. And this creates tension. Not because she is changing, but because your illusion is failing to contain her humanity. And here's where most men become confused. They think something has gone wrong in the relationship. They think she has changed. They think love is fading. But what is actually happening is far more uncomfortable. The fantasy is collapsing under the weight of reality. And when fantasy collapses, it always feels like betrayal. Because you were not in a relationship with her as she is. You were in a relationship with her as you imagined her to be. This is the moment Nietzsche would call awakening. But most people experience it as suffering. Because the mind resists correction. When correction destroys identity, you don't just lose a person in this phase. You lose a story. And for many, the story is more valuable than the truth. The story says you were chosen. The story says you were special. The story says this connection meant something beyond randomness, beyond biology, beyond coincidence. And when that story begins to collapse, you feel not just heartbreak, but existential confusion, as if reality itself has become unstable. But Nietzsche would not call this tragedy. He would call it honesty finally arriving late. Because what is being revealed is not her deception, but your participation in illusion. She did not need to actively lie to you. The mind is perfectly capable of creating entire emotional universes with minimal input. A smile becomes meaning. A gesture becomes narrative. A moment becomes destiny. And slowly, without noticing it, you built a cathedral of belief on top of a very ordinary human being. This is the part most people resist, because it removes blame. And humans prefer blame over responsibility when truth becomes uncomfortable. It is easier to believe you were misled than to accept that you were projecting. It is easier to believe she changed than to accept that she was never what you imagined to begin with. But Nietzsche was not interested in comfort. He was interested in clarity. And clarity always demands the destruction of false meaning. Once the illusion begins to break, something strange happens. You start seeing moments from the past differently. The same memories you once used as proof of destiny now look ambiguous. Her kindness was not proof of fate. It was simply kindness. Her distance was not betrayal. It was simply distance. Her attention was not commitment. It was simply attention. Everything becomes simpler, but also colder, because meaning was removed, and the mind, which depends on meaning to function emotionally, interprets this clarity as loss. And yet, hidden inside this loss is something most people never reach while still trapped in fantasy. You begin to see her as a separate being again, not a symbol, not a role, not a reflection of your emotional needs, but a human being with her own contradictions, instincts, patterns, and autonomy. And this is the first moment of real perception, not romantic perception, not idealized perception, but actual perception. However, this clarity comes with a cost. Because once you see clearly, you can no longer unsee. You cannot return to the comfort of illusion with innocence. You can still choose illusion, but you will know it is illusion. And that changes everything. Because now, even your desire feels different. Less pure, less naive, more conscious. And consciousness always removes the emotional sedation that ignorance provides. Nietzsche would argue that this is the beginning of maturity, not the end of love. But it feels like an ending because the emotional structure you depended on has dissolved. You are no longer relating through fantasy. You are relating through awareness, and awareness does not inflate emotion. It stabilizes it. It strips away exaggeration. It removes projection. And in doing so, it forces you into a quieter, more grounded experience of reality. This is where the real question emerges. Not what happened to her, but why did I need her to be something she wasn't? And that question is far more dangerous than heartbreak. Because it leads inward. It reveals the architecture of desire itself. It exposes how much of your emotional world was built not on connection, but on compensation. Compensation for emptiness. Compensation for lack of identity. Compensation for internal fragmentation. And once you see that, you begin to understand something profound. She was never responsible for your wholeness. She was never designed to carry your emotional structure. She was never yours in the way your imagination claimed. She was a separate consciousness moving through her own reality, intersecting with yours temporarily. And what you called possession was actually encounter. What you called destiny was actually timing. What you called loss was actually impermanence revealing itself. Nietzsche did not destroy love. He stripped it of illusion. And what remains after illusion is removed is not emptiness, but truth. And truth does not promise permanence. It does not promise completion. It does not promise salvation. It simply reveals what is. And if you can stand in that reality without collapsing back into fantasy, something new becomes possible. Not the fantasy of ownership, not the fantasy of completion, but the possibility of relating without illusion, seeing without distortion, loving without needing to rewrite reality into something it is not. And that is where the transformation begins. Because she was never yours. Not because something was stolen, but because nothing was ever owned. And the moment you understand that, you stop trying to possess people and start understanding them. You stop chasing meaning through projection and start building meaning through awareness. And in that shift, something unexpected happens. You don't lose love, you lose illusion. And what remains is far more difficult, but far more real. And maybe that's the part no one tells you. When the illusion dies, it doesn't feel like wisdom at first. It feels like silence, like something has been taken away. But slowly, if you don't run back into fantasy, you realize something unexpected. You were not losing her. You were losing the version of her your mind invented to protect itself. And in that space where illusion used to live, something quieter begins to form. Clarity, responsibility, awareness, not the kind that makes life easier, but the kind that makes it real. Because once you've seen through illusion, you don't go back to being blind. You only go forward being honest. If this message hits something deep in you, don't ignore it. Like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear the truth, and subscribe for more content that doesn't comfort illusions, but challenges them.